Hey, what's up? It's Phoenix and welcome back to my YouTube channel. I encourage you to hit that like button, to subscribe for more quality content, and to share with your friends. I also encourage you to check out the playlist tab for more videos and to check out my books on my author page. I'll put the link in the description. Now, today I'm going to talk about Porphyry as part of my ongoing Philosopher series. I'm very excited to do this and to do this for my Philosopher series, of which you can find more videos in the playlist tab on the Philosopher series, so I encourage you to check that out. And without further ado, let's dive right in. Now, what can I say about the philosopher Porphyry? I would say that I was able to read his book, Isagoge, which means introduction, and I'm very excited to dive into this work. I will admit it wasn't an easy thing to be able to understand the work of Porphyry, and there are several reasons for this. One reason is because you can't really dive into his works because most of his works are no longer extant, as they were from the ancient world and they were lost. And the only book that we really have is this Isagoge introduction, which is unfortunately not nearly as in-depth as I would have liked for his philosophical thinking, and focuses more on Aristotle as well as Plato. But this was an introduction to the categories by Aristotle, and so we don't get a lot of Porphyry's actual ideas. And so this can be a difficult thing to analyze. Nonetheless, I'm very excited to talk about this philosopher, so let's dive in. Now, Introduction is an interesting book, and it was written by Porphyry, who was a Neoplatonist. And if you'll remember, Plotinus was also a Neoplatonist. And so if you'll remember that Neoplatonism is the idea that you are able to work and think through and process the philosophy of Plato, and while also developing new ideas and ideas that are your own. So we saw this a lot in Plotinus. Unfortunately, as a Neoplatonist and as someone who studied Plotinus, or studied Plotinus and the Aeneids, it seems that Porphyry unfortunately does not develop too much of his own ideas, but nonetheless his work is very much embedded in Aristotelian thought as well as Platonic thought. And so that was one thing that I wanted to discuss. Now, I would describe the introduction as a bridge of Plato and Aristotle. It seems as though Plotinus, who I've talked about on the Philosopher series already, Plotinus was very much focused on Plato, but it seems that Porphyry was focused on the philosophy of both Plato and Aristotle and being a bridge to those kinds of worlds that were developed by those philosophers, as well as their concepts and ideas. And so there definitely is a contrast between Plato and Aristotle. Porphyry recognized that there are differences between Aristotle's view and Plato's view, in that Plato was often very spiritual and abstract. As you'll remember from other episodes in my Philosopher series on Plato, Plato was very much focused on the ideas and focused on abstract concepts and ideas, while it seems as though Aristotle was focused a lot more on the natural world, on nature, on human nature. And it's very interesting to think about how those two philosophers contrasted. And so Porphyry is definitely thinking about this, thinking about the trajectory of philosophy at that point in time. And it is very interesting to think about how, as a Neoplatonist, that with the introduction, Porphyry was trying to bridge that gap between the two philosophers. Now, one thing that is interesting about Porphyry is that he was very much an influence on logic as we see it today and as we saw it develop throughout the Middle Ages and beyond that period of time. And oftentimes logic was separate from mathematics, but the attempt was to bring that more together in more modern times, and that would seemingly be because of Porphyry's introduction and Porphyry's way of looking at logic and thinking about these things. And so the influence on logic that Porphyry has is definitely influenced by his thinking on logic, and that would be specifically with three concepts that I'm going to discuss very briefly, but specifically the way that we look at universals. And so there are many ways, for example, of looking at math. Do numbers correspond to something in the world, or do they correspond to something abstract? And this is a discussion that you often find in logic and in mathematics, because it's a very weighty and interesting topic and very important. And so the three concepts that I would like to reference are realism, conceptualism, and nominalism. And before I do that, I will define universals in this case as being what terms actually refer to. And so often this discussion gets complicated in philosophy, in logic, in math, because we're often trying to think about what universals actually refer to. And so in the realm of realism, it would seem as though aspects and items that universals refer to are actually independent of the universals. So as an example, if you're saying that there is a chair, you would say that the chair exists in nature. The chair exists without the term chair. And that's a very powerful way of looking at that. But then in conceptualism, which you kind of find in Kantian idealism and in German idealism, you get the idea that concepts only exist in the mind. And so basically the chair only exists in your mind. And the other view is nominalism, which is that universals don't exist at all. And you often find this in the work of postmodernists and people like Foucault and Derrida, where the words that they use, such as chair, don't immediately correspond to things that actually exist. Now, the reason why this is important in the context of Porphyry is because Porphyry was helpful in developing the way that we look at universals. So Aristotle had a very logical way of looking at words and concepts and universals. And so it's very interesting to see how he deals with these kinds of things. And so as an example, ideas and universals can be organized. And this is extremely important when you take an example in logic or in thought or a universal itself of the phrase, Socrates is a man. And the reason why this is so important is because Socrates as a man is a kind of universal, but there are so many ways that you can describe universals. There are so many ways that you can describe items and things in the world. And this is what Porphyry is trying to develop in his system. And so Socrates does not just have to be a man. Socrates can also be an animal. There could also be traits about Socrates, such as the idea that he is wise or that he is intelligent. And so the best way to describe this is in terms of the actual literal terms that Porphyry uses in his work. There are the predicables, as they are called, genera, species, differences, properties, and accidents. And so, as an example, the genus is animal, that of species is man, of difference is rational, of property capable of laughing, and of accident white, black, and sitting. Now, there's a little bit to unpack there, and it is a little bit difficult, but I will focus on making this concise and as clear as it can possibly be. What Porphyry is doing by analyzing Aristotle, and specifically the categories, as remember, the introduction is an introduction to categories by Aristotle, there are ways of classifying things in the world. So to say that Socrates is rational is a difference. To say that Socrates is an animal is a genus. And that is an example of ways that you can describe the world. And basically, in this really intense example, it is very clear that we are able to conceptualize the world through these categories and through these ideas and these ways of organizing the world with our concepts and with the way that we look at the world. And so the reason why it is so important to identify the idea of Socrates as a man, or Socrates as an animal, or Socrates as rational, is because these are various ways in which we can describe the world. And I have always found, I'll admit, Aristotle's categories and logic to be confusing, because we don't use these terms as these terms so immediately in the world, but they're nonetheless useful ways of constructing an understanding of logic, of the world, and of what actually exists. And so even though those examples were a little bit difficult, it is interesting to think about how those kinds of things help us build an understanding of the world through logic and through math, through reasoning, through philosophy, and I find that to be very valuable. So I will admit Porphyry was very difficult to dive into, and I will admit I still don't fully understand his thinking, though I can see how he influenced philosophy from that period on, and how he was very instrumental in helping us understand Aristotle and Plato in a philosophical context as well as a historical context. But I'll admit, I'm not always immediately sure how to apply some of these ideas of logic. Often there is a separation between the form of logic and the actual implications and consequences of that logic. And so that can be difficult to do sometimes. I nonetheless, because I like exploring, enjoyed reading Porphyry's book, The Introduction, and I found it interesting just for thinking about terms and the way that we think about life and reality and the world and philosophy. And so even if I don't immediately click with his way of describing the world and immediately understand these very, I would describe, ancient concepts, it doesn't mean that it doesn't intrigue us and tantalize us to think about the world in a variety of different ways, and to realize that even with the universals that we use, there are a lot of assumptions in the words and the universals themselves that we use and the way in which we conceptualize them. So that is something very important to keep in mind. By utilizing the examples of nominalism, conceptualism, and realism through the history of philosophy, I was able to show you the way in which some philosophers come to certain conclusions. And I think that's very important for thinking about universals and thinking about how we do come to our conclusions about the world and how we think about them. And so the way that we view universals really does influence the way that we actually think about the world. And I think that that is one of the most interesting things that comes out of Porphyry and this lineage of Plato, Aristotle, Plotinus, and other thinkers. So yeah, I'm Phoenix, and I hope that you enjoyed this talk. I hope that you found it to be very meaningful. Be sure to check out these books online and the other philosophers that I've talked about in my series, and be sure to check out my other videos. I'm Phoenix, and I really appreciate you stopping by. There will be much more content to come, and especially for my Philosopher series. So yeah, I will see you next time. Thank you for watching.